Okay, let's take a look at antidepressant drugs now. So basically, we're going to find out that there's four different types of antidepressant drugs that we use to treat depression. And then after we go over these antidepressant drugs, we'll go on to some alternative therapies. So here's the first one. So these are the tricyclic antidepressants, and they're actually named for the structure that they seem to be cyclical in nature. They work on dopamine, epinephrine, and serotonin, so kind of the catecholamines and serotonin, and they block the transporter molecules, so it leaves these in the synapse for longer. So there's a there's a transporter molecule that pulls them out of the synapse after they've been released, and what it does is it blocks them, and it just like if you can imagine a wheel turning, and then all of a sudden it puts a like a stick in the wheel so the wheel can't turn and it's just left in the synapse. But the problem with these is that they have many side effects because they're working on three different neurotransmitters and they're blocking histamine, which seems to cause drowsiness, and they also block acetylcholine, which causes a dry mouth. So people have to balance between, oh, is this working for my mood and dealing with all the side effects. So, a much more common one that's prescribed all the time now is the SSRIs, or are the SSRIs. So, the SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So, basically, I'm going to show you an animation in just a minute. But basically, the serotonin gets released, and then what happens is these drugs just block it, so they can't get reuptaken. So they're trying to come back into the presynaptic cell, but they're left in the synapse. And once the neurotransmitter is left in the synapse, all it's going to do is it's going to continually stimulate the postsynaptic receptors. So here's a brief animation of the how an SSRI works. Okay, so there's the neurotransmitter being released into the synapse, and then there's reuptake. The packet releases it, reuptake, but now when you put the drug in, it blocks the reuptake. So it continually stimulates it. Let's watch it again one more time. Okay, so we've got the synapsing neuron. When it has an action potential, it releases the neurotransmitter, then it gets reuptaken. We learned that. Release the neurotransmitter, but now you have the drug in, and the drug is blocking the reuptake. So the serotonin stays in the synapse and it continues to stimulate the neuron. Okay, so hopefully that animation helped you out with understanding how SSRIs work. Now, the next one, these are not prescribed usually unless the SSRIs have been tried, and they're usually tried for maybe about 6 weeks. And then if they're not working, then they'll try different SSRIs, and then maybe they'll go on to the tricyclics. And if they're not working, then they might go on to these MAOIs. So MAO stands for monoamine oxidase. So you've got this chemical that breaks down it will break down the monoamines, which is like dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, serotonin, those simple neurotransmitters. And so by blocking this breakdown molecule, remember we learned that in the 6 steps of the synapse, and I kind of taught it a little bit different. I said, oh, they can either be reuptaken or broken down, or sometimes they're reuptaken and broken down. So these types will block that enzyme. So basically, it's working to leave these guys in the synapse too. But the problem with this one is there seems to be all these different food interactions that cause problems. And so there's a long list of foods that you can't eat if you take this medication. So you might want to Google those foods that can be eaten. But I know cheese, raisins, lots of fruits, all kinds of stuff. So for a lot of people, changing their diet that much is not something they want to do. Okay, On to atypical antidepressants. So these are ones that seem to work a little bit differently, but you've tried other things or not seem to be working. Let's try something else. So, Wellbutrin is one that probably a lot of you have heard of that's actually prescribed to stop smoking. It can be prescribed for other kind of addictions, dealing with addictions. But for some reason, on some people, this seems to work on depression. And a major side effect of the antidepressants, which the book isn't really talking about very much, I didn't see it in there in the 12th edition, is the sexual dysfunctions. People have a loss of desire for sex, and maybe they can have sexual, difficulties lubricating, difficulties getting an erection, sometimes a loss of interest in relationships altogether, and it makes it very difficult to be, with someone like that. So when you take the Wellbutrin, a lot of times that particular one will not cause those same sexual side effects. And so people who are like really taken aback by these sexual side effects, a lot of times they turn to the Wellbutrin. Now, the ketamine, what an interesting one. So ketamine is related to PCP. It's used in veterinary clinics as an anesthetic drug, and we know that it's kind of in the kind of rave world of the kind of underground party drugs. So they have found that ketamine actually seems to work for relieving depression, but the problem is that it causes hallucinations and other things. So they're trying to figure out how to use this, or maybe to synthesize something that's similar to it that doesn't have all these side effects, but it is used for some people as an antidepressant. This other one I don't know much about. It's in your textbook, so I thought I would include it. It's L-acetylcarnitine. And so this creates epigenetic changes at the glutamate synapse, and it seems promising in the treatment of depression, and maybe there will be more to come. Now, St. John's wort has always been so interesting to me. It's been around for a long time, and you can get it at your local nutrition store. However, it is not FDA regulated, and so you get all different dosages depending on where you're getting it from. And some people seem to respond as well to the St. John's wort as antidepressant medications. And the thing is you can pick it up without a prescription. So a problem is that sometimes you don't know the dosage that you're getting because it's not FDA regulated. Is this good stuff? Is this bad stuff? And then it has this. It seems to encourage the liver to break down toxins, which you would think is a good thing, but what it does is it seems to stop your other medications from working, and it can cause some problems. But hey, if you have somebody in your life that's super depressed, or you wrestle with depression, then maybe you want to check this one out. It's literally a trip to the local nutrition store. Okay, so on to this one, the Enigma of How Antidepressants Are Working. Now, this is something that's so interesting. Is I'm going to show you some other slides on the effectiveness of antidepressants, and here's the problem. Drugs usually take its effect within hours, but even though they can take an effect in hours, it usually takes weeks to see any rise in mood elevation. You can't go to some party and say, "Hey, I'm gonna pop a Prozac and I'm gonna get happy tonight." So no, we're not doing that. By the way, though, back to the atypical antidepressants. Yes, ecstasy is being tested to see if it works as an antidepressant, because yes, it does work at those glutamate synapses. They didn't really talk about that in the book, but I'll just throw that in there in a sidelight. Also, ecstasy seems to be used. They're trying it out for post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, but let's go back to this, the enigma of how these antidepressants are working. So they take effect within hours, but we don't see any mood elevation for 2 weeks. And then your textbook also talks about that, hey, through your diet, you can change the amount of serotonin that's being released, just through a change in the diet. And we don't see people going into a depression because of that. So then they have this BDNF hypothesis, which I showed you in one of the videos. I thought that was just a great video. You might want to go back and review that if you forgot. But It was talking about how, the early theories thought that we had low levels of serotonin and that these antidepressants are working by raising the low levels of serotonin, but now we're down to this new kind of theory that maybe the antidepressants are raising the brain derived nerve growth factor, which we learned about that in the chapter where we learned about brain development and brain plasticity. And we talked about that, in order for a neuron to not die, to commit apoptosis, we have to have this neurotropin released. And so they're thinking that maybe the raising of the serotonin encourages more of this, the brain derived nerve growth factor. And what this does is it does seem to help the proliferation of new cells in the hippocampus. So here's a slide for you. In both videos that I showed you, they both hyped on, like, hey, in depression, we see a shrunken hippocampus. Both of them talked about that. And then your textbook, and I've talked about it in the past too, is also showing that when you're depressed, you tend to have more right hemispheric activation. And we're going to go back to that when we talk about some alternative ways to deal with depression. So remember, the right hemisphere was in imagination. It seems to process your negative emotions more. It's also involved in art and spatial awareness and facial recognition. We talked about that in that chapter where we talked about lateralization. So anyway, they think that maybe this brain-derived nerve growth factor creates new cells in the hippocampus. And we do see, the hippocampus can get larger. And we did learn in chapter that, you can have neurogenesis in the hippocampus. But here's again a problem. Some studies find that antidepressants do increase the brain-derived nerve growth factor. Other studies do not. Dang, every time we get so excited about something, something goes wrong. If you raise brain derived nerve growth factor by itself, there does not seem to be mood elevation. So, some studies are finding, yep, we think it. But anyway, let's get down to this nitty gritty. Proliferation of cells in the hippocampus seem to be key. And if you remember when I taught you about neurogenesis, I told you in the hippocampus, remember when we went back in that chapter where we talked about brain growth and neurogenesis and plasticity? Is we talked about how exercise is definitely linked to neurogenesis. And I've shown you about how exercise seems to be related to, all these different things, that 30% of people get better through exercise alone. Your textbook says that, exercise is not really a good therapy for people alone in and of itself. But as we look at some of these next statistics, a lot of people get better just with nothing. So I think exercise is a great way to go, and maybe you can share that with people. Like, if you've got somebody in your life that's depressed, say, come on, let's go for a walk. Let's go out. Okay. So anyway, what they think is as the hippocampus grows, perhaps the increase allows for new coping skills. So let's talk about these new coping skills, shall we? Okay, but before we go to these new coping skills, let's hit on this just one more time, this enigma thing. So depression comes in episodes. Some people seem to get better with just time. Okay. Young people seem to be more responsive to placebos even than the drug treatment, the anticipation of something working. So, antidepressants and psychotherapy increase activity in the same parts of the brain, and they seem to have about the same amount of effectiveness. Severe depression may be better treated with antidepressants. I know in previous editions of the textbooks, they talked about people that were severely abused in childhood, that they didn't really respond as well to psychotherapy. This textbook isn't really talking about that, but they are finding again that severe depression, there may be a little bit more benefits with this antidepressant, but the mild or moderate, they're saying, sometimes you just get better with time. We're seeing a lot of placebo effect. We're getting the same brain activation of antidepressants and psychotherapy. And so basically the be all and end all final segment of this chapter on how effective our antidepressants are this. is some people recover over time with no treatment. Some people seem to respond better to therapy or antidepressants, and they kind of have their preference. And then one third to one half of people did not respond well to either. So I think I'm going to stop here, and then we'll go to the cognitive therapy. Just I wanted to give you a little bit of background about changing your thoughts, maybe changing your life.